Allow me to introduce myself.
I am the last sane sports fan.
I am a genius by trade.
I just knew too much. Does that make me crazy? Does that make me crazy? Does that make me crazy? Possibly.
Hello everyone and welcome once again to The View from the Midwest. Well, it's been a couple weeks since I did a show. I apologize for that, but I was out of town with an actual paying broadcasting gig. Yeah, hooray for me. But let's get right to today's show because these NFL shows end up running a little bit too long sometimes. So let's get right into it. We'll go all the way back to Thursday when the Vikings played the Cardinals, and the Vikings ended up dropping that one by a score of 23-20. And it was an interesting game because going into it, personally, although Bridgewater has not performed all that badly, I would have given the edge to Arizona simply because they looked much better going into it. And although the fact that Minnesota has Adrian Peterson, you still think as an overall team, Minnesota would not have fared as well. But until they started making a lot of key mistakes towards the end of the game, they were really in this one, and it ended up being an absolutely close contest, a joy to watch for those of you who have the NFL Network and could watch Thursday Night Football. It was an interesting statistical battle because nobody really won that in a total. If you look at individual players, Bridgewater had 335 yards and a touchdown. Palmer 310 yards and 2 touchdowns. So you would give the slight edge to the quarterback who throws for more touchdowns as opposed to more yards. Rushing, it was kind of similar. Adrian Peterson had a touchdown but only 69 yards and a fumble. Johnson for Arizona only had 92 yards but no scores. And the fourth quarter ended up being kind of the big difference. Or I should say really the third quarter, because getting shut out, Minnesota really kind of hurt them. They only ended up losing by 3. They outscored Arizona 10-6 in the fourth quarter, so it ended up being kind of a devastating loss because even though Minnesota is still at 8-5, still in an opportunity to make the playoffs, they have now fallen behind the Green Bay Packers a little bit because the Green Bay Packers, as we'll talk about in a little bit if I can get my words out, ended up with a pretty big and comfortable victory over the weekend. So Arizona improves to 11-2, 8-5, as I mentioned, for Minnesota. Pretty big loss, though, overall for Minnesota, as they had a chance to really kind of solidify themselves as a definite NFC North title contender. Moving on, we'll talk about the Browns against the 49ers. The Browns with a surprising win. I mean, the 49ers have had an absolutely terrible year. This is going to be their first losing season since 2010, as they are now guaranteed to have a losing record. So it wasn't a game that you'd necessarily say, well, the 49ers are favored to win, but the Browns have just looked so bad at times during the year. They can look decent, they can look bad. This was a game to where they looked pretty good. Johnny Manziel ended up throwing for 270 yards and a touchdown with 1 interception, and he kind of beat himself up. If you've watched ESPN or any kind of social media on sports, that video's kind of gone around where he's pretty much slamming the tablet that they use instead of now photographs to look at plays and everything that have gone wrong or even have gone right and see what the defense is doing and all that. He's slamming it up against his forehead. Looks kind of silly, but it shows that he cares. I wouldn't necessarily advocate any quarterback to do that, but it does show that he cares about what's going on in the game, and that's a positive step for that young man. Crowell had 145 yards and 2 touchdowns running, and they ended up pretty much dominating the game from start to finish. They shut out the 49ers in the first quarter and the third quarter, only allowed 10 points and a field goal in the first half, and obviously the touchdown in the fourth quarter when it didn't really matter anymore in the 24-10 victory. Cleveland improves to 3-10, so they're not going anywhere. But I still don't think Johnny Manziel is probably going to be a long-term NFL quarterback, but at least he's showing that perhaps he's trying to turn things around. He gets it a little bit more, and we'll have to wait and see what he can produce going forward, because I think they are going to use him as the quarterback going forward, if nothing else, just to know what they have and whether or not they need to invest in that position again. Talking about some of the other games, Saints versus the Buccaneers. Saints pull off another win. Those have been few and far between for them this season, as they are now 5-8 with that divisional victory. over the Buccaneers. The Saints defense did pretty good in this one, though. They held Jameis Winston to only 182 yards passing, did throw for 1 touchdown, but Drew Brees looked a little bit more like the Drew Brees of old. He had 312 yards passing and 2 touchdowns. Decent day rushing for the Saints, 85 yards for Hightower and a touchdown. And they, again, defensively, they allowed 10 points in the second quarter and 7 in the fourth, but shutouts in the odd-numbered quarters for the Saints defense, and they managed to score in every quarter except for the fourth. It almost kind of came back to haunt them if the Buccaneers could have come back and scored a few more points, because the Buccaneers did get a touchdown there at the end, but it ended up not mattering. The Saints are now 5-8, game behind the 6-7 Tampa Bay Buccaneers. But again, with Carolina looking like they could go through the regular season undefeated, that division has pretty much long been decided. Moving on now, the Jets versus the Titans. The Titans, again, just look awful. Only 8 points scored. They lose 30-8 to the New York Jets, who are not that great of a team, despite the fact that they have an 8-5 record. Tennessee is now 3-10. They pretty much deserve to be where they're at. Marcus Mariota, not a terrible day. He's still kind of growing into that position, and we kind of knew going in that he was going to have some growing pains because he comes from a college system, and it's getting to be to a point to where when they come out of those spread systems, it doesn't mean that you can't be a good quarterback, but it means you're not going to be one right off the bat very often unless you are just supremely talented. And Marcus Mariota is very talented, but not to that level. He threw for 274, 1 interception, no touchdowns. Ryan Fitzpatrick had a pretty damn good day, sorry for the language. 263 yards, not great there, but 3 touchdowns for the Jets, and that's basically all they needed. The rushing leader for Tennessee shows you how bad of a day they had. McCluster had 12 yards rushing. He was their team leader in rushing. They scored all 8 points in the third quarter, were shut out in the rest, and that's not going to win you very many ball games. So the Titans only with 3 wins on the year. In a very intriguing game, the Steelers ended up knocking off the Bengals to really kind of put themselves back into the mix. They are now 8-5, still a couple games behind Cincinnati for that division lead. Cincinnati falls to 10-3, but it really kind of solidifies Pittsburgh as not going away, because they were starting to fade a little bit. They were kind of up and down whether or not they had Ben Roethlisberger in there or not. Roethlisberger obviously played in this one. He threw for 282, did have a pick. A.J. McCarron ended up being the leading passer for Cincinnati, because that's the big story for them. Andy Dalton injured his hand, and unfortunately for the Bengals, it is his throwing hand. Now, it did come out today that it's not going to require surgery, but it is still probably either dislocated or broken, so it's going to be a week-to-week thing, but at best, they were still kind of prognosticating that he might return for the playoffs. McCarron didn't have too bad of a day, 282 yards with 2 touchdowns, but he threw for 2 picks, and that might have been the big difference in this one, as the Bengals lose by 13, but it really wasn't even all that close. The Steelers jumped out to a big lead, 7 points in the first, 9 in the second. They only allowed 7 points all half. Pittsburgh got just enough in the in the third and fourth quarters, but Cincinnati tried to come back. But when you're not dealing with your normal starting quarterback, it's going to be difficult. But it is going to be difficult for Pittsburgh to catch up. But without Andy Dalton right now, Cincinnati might be fading a little bit. The Jaguars absolutely blow out the Colts, who are now without Matt Hasselbeck, and their quarterback situation is an absolute mess because Andrew Luck is still not back from a lacerated kidney issue, or it might have been liver. I apologize for not knowing that 100%, but still, it was an internal organ with a laceration. He hopes to be in practice this week, but even if he is, that probably means that he's not going to be able to play. Hasselbeck is now out. They will hope that maybe he can be available for a backup situation, but he's got damaged ribs now, which are difficult to come back even in the best of situations, and they made the Jaguars look like world beaters. The Jaguars win 51-16 in one of the worst seasons that Indianapolis has had since that year that Peyton Manning went down, and showed that basically without Peyton Manning they were an awful team. Indianapolis falls to 6-7. The Jaguars are now 5-8, but Indianapolis, even though their division is not the best. They're fading fast, and it would take a miracle for them to really pull something off like that. The Chiefs with a disappointing game, but they got the victory, and at this point of the season, that is what you're looking for, especially due to the fact that the Broncos ended up falling in a divisional matchup as well. So the Chiefs, Alex Smith, day not necessarily to remember, but again, you get the victory, 191 yards, touchdown on a pick. The leading rusher for Kansas City was West. He only had 54 yards. But as I mentioned, in the grand scheme of things, Kansas City improves to 8-5, and they keep themselves alive in that division race. And that is the key right now. The Bears, another awful performance. I mean, the game was close there at the end. They probably should have tied it up. Robbie Gould, who is normally very consistent, normally very, I wouldn't say money, because he will miss a kick now and then, but he's still one of the better kickers in the league throughout his career. But he missed a game-tying field goal right at the end of the game. It ended up really kind of costing the Bears. They could have gone into overtime, but ultimately Chicago just didn't do enough to deserve to win. They scored 3 times. Jay Cutler had 2 of those touchdowns, 315 yards. Not a bad day at the office, but Matt Forte was held to only 45 yards. He did get a score, but again, when you're not rushing for the kind of yards they need Matt Forte to rush for, then it becomes difficult to pick up a victory. 14 of Chicago's 21 points came in third. They did not score at all in the fourth, and when you do that, you're going to fall to 5-8, which the Bears did, because it's very difficult to win when you're not scoring in crunch time in the fourth quarter. Let's talk about the Raiders and the Broncos, I should say. The Raiders with a 15-12 win. Brock Osweiler threw for 308 yards, which kind of changed from yesterday because I thought they listed it as 315. Doesn't really matter. He was 35 for 51, though, because it's weird because the whole situation during the time with Peyton Manning was they need to rush the ball more, and they gave Ronnie Hillman 12 carries, and he only got 50 yards. And they kind of gave up on the rushing attack. Now, some of that had to do to the fact that they weren't playing well, especially in the second half. All 12 of Denver's points came in the first half. They got shut out completely in the second half. But Brock Osweiler, he's not a bad quarterback. I can't say that he's not going to be their quarterback going forward. But the idea of not bringing Peyton Manning back if he's healthy, to me, is utterly ludicrous right now, because Brock Osweiler hasn't been lighting the world on fire. I think a lot of the Denver problems on offense are with the offensive line. They're with receivers not necessarily catching balls. That game a few weeks ago, even though they defeated the Green Bay Packers, there were so many drop balls, especially by Demaryius Thomas, who is one of the more sure-handed guys in the league, but he's not catching balls right now. And Denver falls to 10-3, keeping Kansas City in the mix. You would like to think that given Denver's defense that they won't fall apart and they will still win that division. But without a quarterback, with that situation kind of in flux, everything's kind of up in the air. We talked a little bit about the Packers and the Cowboys. I had already mentioned the Packers won. The final there was 28-7. Matt Castle just not getting the job done right now for the Cowboys, as basically if Tony Romo is not there, then the Cowboys just stink. They just flat out stink. And Jerry Jones can say what he wants. He can say that Brandon Weeden is awful. He can declare him the next Fran Tarkenton. He can say that, oh, well, Matt Castle would have won the games that Brandon Weeden would have lost, or Matt Castle is awful. I don't care what he says. The guy is out of his mind, because he has obviously not assembled a team that is capable of winning, because when you're that dependent on one man in Tony Romo to where you can't even get yourself in the game in some of these other games, then they've obviously not done their job. They didn't get a decent enough backup before the season. They had to bring Castle in after he was cut by the Buffalo Bills. Aaron Rodgers, again, not a great day, only 218 yards, but 2 touchdowns. Eddie Lacy had 124 yards in the score. So it ended up being a big day for the Packers, who improved to 9-4. And as I mentioned, they step up a game over Minnesota now, really kind of trying to put their stamp on that division lead. Patriots and the Texans. Texans fall 27-6. That one was pretty much expected. Brian Hoyer didn't even get to 200 yards passing, 155. As this one was kind of a cakewalk for New England, as they shut out Houston in the second half. All 6 of the Texans' points come in the first half, so the Texans fall to 6-7. Again, kind of in that awful AFC South division. Everybody's kind of still alive. Nobody's really putting their stamp on that division, much the same as the NFC East, but right now the Texans just don't look like doing anything. Let's get to the St. Louis Rams game. Potentially, it's something that I don't necessarily like to think about it, but it was potentially the last Sunday home game that will ever be played in St. Louis, because basically if the Rams move, the NFL will probably never return to the city, at least within many of our lifetimes. You can never say never. 21-14 victory over the Detroit Lions. The Lions fall to 4-9. St. Louis improves to 5-5, keeping a vague chance of finishing at 500 alive, although most of us don't figure that that will happen, despite the positive feelings that we had towards the beginning of the year. The team has kind of proven that to be not the case. So finishing at 500 is going to be very difficult, especially given the quarterback position. Case Keenum threw for 124 yards and a pick. If not for Todd Gurley, again, this offense would be absolutely nothing. He had 2 touchdowns and 140 yards. Both touchdowns, he barely made it in, and they were unbelievably effort-driven touchdowns that basically he was just going to not be denied. The leading receiver for the Rams was Kenny Britt with 2 receptions and 35 yards. Shows you what a horrible passing day it was for the St. Louis Rams, but that's kind of been something that Rams fans have been accustomed to as of late. 7-0 at halftime. The Rams had the lead. They let Detroit tie it up in the third, but then they scored a touchdown. Both teams had a touchdown again in the fourth, giving you your final of 21-14. I could do a whole different video about the stadium situation and what's the latest with that. I might try to do that tomorrow or perhaps later on in the week, because there is a little bit of movement going on with that, but still there's so much that you hear on both sides. There's nothing really to add to it at this point in time, so I might get into that a little bit later. It was good to see the Rams pick up a win. The stadium was not necessarily all that full, although there was a decent crowd, but there was a few Detroit fans there as well, as there tends to be in these kind of situations. Hopefully, regardless of what the outcome might be in the end, hopefully this Thursday game that's coming up against Tampa Bay, the fans will pack the stadium, because it would nice to be able to say, regardless if the team moves, if the team stays, that when it came down to crunch time, they filled the building and basically said, hey, we were an NFL city, we are an NFL city, whatever the case may be, and show the NFL that they're kind of silly taking this team away for a city that didn't necessarily support them all that well to begin with. I know that there are people out there who will disagree with that point, and understandably so, because they were there, they saw it. All I can do is look what's on TV at the time, and the stadiums weren't being filled at the time. They're not necessarily being filled now either, but that's all conjecture at this point. It was good to see the St. Louis Rams pick up a victory, although it wasn't that impressive overall. But St. Louis still with a chance to finish 500, and at this point in the season, Jeff Fisher, I mean, his future is up in the air, whether or not they move, whether they stay. That is all conjecture as well at this point. But still, good to see the St. Louis Rams pick up a victory to kind of pick up people's spirits at this time, because it was getting to be very difficult, the fact that they had gone from 4-3 to 4-8, now 5-8. It was a really hard losing streak for many of the NFL fans in St. Louis to swallow. But that is the view from the Midwest. What were your views on all the games that happened over the weekend, and obviously last Thursday as well? Let us know in the comments. Comment, rate, and subscribe. But until the next time, I'll see you then.
I remember when I lost my mind. There was something so pleasant about that place. Even your emotions have an echo in so much space. And when you're out there without care,